Thank you. My name is William Collins. I spent 15 years grinding in large enterprise. So started out in professional services, financial services, and then transitioned to healthcare. And today I work for Alkira, a startup. And also run a podcast that sort of delves into I'd say the intricacies of cloud technology, cybersecurity. A lot of guests on AI and machine learning recently, just to try to figure out like what is real and what is not real there, which is a pretty difficult thing sometimes. So today I want to look at infrastructure evolving. If I look at a lot of the patterns that we deployed, in financial services and healthcare, I feel like we sort of keep reinventing the wheel. And I like to go back and just try to learn, like, okay, we did this thing, it didn't work. Why didn't it work? And what can we do to sort of take a step back and look at the forest from the trees? So I'm going to start out with a story about, you might think that that's backwards. You might think that you got to, crawl first. But when I was working in enterprise for all the, 15 years, we'd always start out sprinting. And then we'd have to fall on our face a few times, learn a few lessons. And then like, okay, now we're going to walk. Oh, we still can't walk. We got to figure out how to crawl first. So like trying to, break that pattern. And then just looking at today's tech landscape. If I took 3 use cases that I see across many big companies today that they're still trying to solve. So I want to sort of break those down and, just encapsulate where they're at today. And then square pegs and round holes. Might talk a little about SD-WAN, a little about SASE. Some of these things are going to be my opinion, but I'm also going to quote Gartner. So there's some facts there as well, some statistics. And then what might a pragmatic way forward look like, as far as building an architecture and just thinking not just about short-term gains, like, oh, it's 2025, 2024, we want to make a huge impact in 5 months and we're going to rush all these things through. That's usually not a recipe for, long-term success. So we'll look at that a little bit. So first things first, this is actually a 100% true story that I told to a CIO one time that I reported to get them to slow down digital transformation. So it was for a large organization, and cloud was just gaining so much momentum, and we had a new leader come in, and they said, hey, we want to get out of our data centers, and we want to do it like this year. We have 2,000 applications. We're just going to get this done. And we all know how that might look. Refactoring a single application, peeling off all the different data sources, and getting CI/CD, your pipelining, and all the different scaffolding in the cloud setup. All these things take a lot of time. And then you throw in maybe a company that's been around for a really long time, that's built a lot of stuff over the years, got a lot of processes. This isn't as simple as, hey, we just, flip the light switch and these things are in cloud and we can just turn off the power to the data centers. So we're going through all this and we're trying to get them to slow down a little bit. And we have technical decision makers like at the bottom, just like looking up Mount Everest, like, hey, slow down, we got to slow down. And then we had leadership from the top down saying, hey, no, we're going to just throw more bodies at the problem. We're going to throw more money at the problem, and it'll sort itself out. And it didn't sort itself out. So my wife was a teacher for a long time. And I think after we had our second kid, she decided to stay home and just try to do kid stuff, a lot of running around and all that. And she also went back to college for a music major. So she learned cello, piano, violin, and she started giving private lessons out of her house. So one day, and this was in the midst of all this digital transformation craziness, she had a new student come in, and I was upstairs. Like my routine, I make a French press in the morning, and I knock that thing out before like 8 a.m. That's my morning. So I'm up there making a French press. This new student comes in. He must have been like 8 years old, and his light behind his eyes. He was so happy. He came in. He's going to learn to play some music, just thrilled. So like I go downstairs for a little bit, and I come back up to get something, and that kid's walking out of the house, and he looks crushed. Like there's no light behind the eyes. It's like they canceled Christmas and his birthday. I thought he was going to cry. So they leave, and I look at my wife, and I'm like, what happened? He looks miserable. And she's like, well, he wanted to learn Beethoven in his first lesson. And I was like, oh. And I was like, well, how long has he been playing piano? And she's like, they just got their first keyboard last week. He's never played. And I was like, oh. And then for some reason, like in my brain, I was like, that is exactly what we're trying to do right now. We're trying to learn to play Beethoven, and we don't have the basics down. So going a little further, this student obviously realized, I don't have the skills to play Beethoven. I just don't have those skills. And, at the same time, like we're, in the digital transformation stuff, there was a lot we didn't know. And it doesn't mean the whole thing was a loss. We have to learn from things that maybe are not executed right the first time. It's got to be a learning exercise, but we don't want to double down and just keep throwing more money in the fire. We want to hit the brakes, we want to pause things and figure out what's best, for the business at that point. And I mean, to that example, like throwing money and people at things, okay, so that child, if you put him at a piano and you surround him by 20 teachers, is he going to learn how to play Beethoven any quicker? No, it's not going to help at all. It's actually going to make things worse. And that's what I've found, in the enterprise side. The more voices, the more people with competing priorities that you throw on these things, it causes a lot of confusion, and it doesn't typically help things go faster the most of the time. So plowing right ahead, so we learn that we can't sprint out of the gate. We got to learn how to walk first, and then okay, we've all been babies before, so we didn't walk right away. We had to learn how to crawl first. So of course, as a child, it's like, okay, I need to learn how to read music before I can play Beethoven. Okay. And for us, it was, we went back to first principles. Things had gotten so complicated, so we had to simplify the whole process. We had to prioritize things. We had to, pick out, there's just a lot that we had to do that we didn't realize that we needed to do. And part of that was a big disconnect between like leadership at the top end and the individual contributors at the bottom end, and making sure that communication gap was shored up and that we understood each other is ultimately what got us into a successful place here. So today's landscape and challenges. It's 2024. I mean, some of these things may seem like basics still, but I would say probably more than 90% of the companies I talk to, and just for a little clarification, I'm talking in terms of like enterprise customers broadly, but these things are probably applicable to, anybody deploying these technologies. So today's landscape and challenges, one of the things I see a lot still is organizations still have a lot of, applications, and a lot of their IP, not IP protocol, but intellectual property is still in the data center. A lot of their data, a lot of their back-end, their reusable services, still living across data centers. So they're trying to come to terms with that. Like, how do we modernize our existing app portfolios and get those to cloud? Well, hey, we got to connect to cloud first. We have to have good, reliable, redundant, and secure connectivity to these cloud providers. And while all this is happening, at least in my experiences, we're also building new greenfield things in the cloud. So there's new innovation happening, there's new products, things that are being built, but again, this is a hybrid world now, and all of our stuff is still back in the data center, like all of our data, so you have to have that hybrid connectivity so these greenfield apps can come and talk back. And then this is this has been a huge one for me everywhere that I've worked, but when I first started working in networking, B2B stuff was, you had your DMZ, you had your applications in your data center, and you had some process that said, hey, we're going to stand up a VPN. Somebody's going to fill out some forms. We're going to have a stand-up call. Maybe there's some natting involved, but we're going to connect via VPN from one place to another. It's in the data center. And this landscape is extremely complicated now because you could have a partner or a third party that has an application in their data center, and maybe they need to connect to something in one of your clouds. Or maybe it's vice versa. You have something in a data center and there's a partner you have that's completely born in the cloud. They don't have data centers. So how do you make these connections, and how do you limit both the blast radius and the attack surface, and only give that partner or that third party precisely what they need access to? And how do you do that and have it not take 2 or 3 months with multiple stand-up calls and multiple different technology types that you're constantly working between? So between these three, this is a lot of work that is still happening with large companies today. And I guess I'm going to pick on SD-WAN a little bit, and not to look, every platform out there, again, SD-WAN has a lot of great use cases. It's a requirement a lot of times. The thing that I see that makes it problematic is when you take SD-WAN and you say, hey, we're going to use SD-WAN to solve all these other problems that SD-WAN wasn't invented to solve. You try to hammer a solution, a round solution in a square peg, and if you hammer hard enough and maybe you can make it fit a little bit, but it's not going to be pretty, it's not going to fit flush, and ultimately it's not going to be good. So one of the big things I've seen, and a lot of times I hear this, okay, we've already deployed SD-WAN, we've already operationalized it, our sites are connected. These cloud folks are just busting our door down. We've got to do cloud networking now. We're just going to extend SD-WAN into the cloud and throw our appliances up there, and that problem solved. And usually my response to this would be, okay, let's take this transport agnostic technology that we've been connecting sites with, we're connecting our WAN with and our data centers with, and we're just going to trade in our physical appliances for some virtuals and shove them into some VNets and VPCs, and then say that's it. We did it. And many of you have probably been in some of these cloud architectures and know that, even high availability. Okay, I need to deploy 2 SD-WAN appliances in a hub maybe across multiple availability zones. All right, how do they fail over? Is that failover quick? How do I stitch traffic to other things? Okay, now I'm paying AWS to host these suckers, and then I'm paying for some egress cost in different places, and I'm also paying a vendor for licensing, and then the cost starts adding up, and then okay, we don't even have good throughput. Like we've already hit our peak. Now what do we do? So you just run into all these different things, and that's just a good example of a square peg in a round hole. It doesn't mean that SD-WAN is bad or it's a bad technology, but hey, infrastructure has evolved, and it may not be the best fit for everything. And we just have to realize that, and we have to look at other things. And my favorite thing to pick on lately has been SASE. I hope I don't rub anybody the wrong way here, but one of the things I see a lot, the single vendor SASE approach, it sounds really good. In fact, if I wasn't in the weeds all the time with this stuff, I'd say, hey, that sounds great. Let's get that in here. One vendor, whatever they say, one throat to choke, all that stuff. Yeah, one vendor, everybody's happy. And, like I see, let's cloudify broad categories of things into a single vendor solution, the easy button for zero trust. That's great. And then my response to this is usually, aggregating many solutions into a single vendor. It sounds great, but there is a lot of trade-offs here. One thing I've noticed is, so just so a lot of security, vendors can get into the SASE space. Like maybe you have one that's doing like firewall as a service and like ZTNA or something. Like they have these 2 that they've built maybe. But then they're just like buying the others and bolting them on real quick, and they're not really vertically integrated. Like one has very limited functionality, and then before you know it, I was just talking to someone the other day at a Fortune like 20 or a Fortune 30 company that's like, yeah, we went all in with the SASE stuff, but now we've had to augment with all these other vendors, and now we're doing an integration strategy to integrate them. And then it's like, well, why did we do a single vendor solution in the first place? And if you're in the weeds with this stuff day in and day out, I didn't need a magic ball to know that this was going to happen. If you work for any big company, like what company has anybody worked for that's used a single vendor for anything across their whole stack? It doesn't exist, and I don't think it ever will. So, plowing right ahead. Again, I'm not trying to throw SASE down, because there's a lot of, maybe there are, it's like Meraki in a way. I love the Meraki solution, and I went all in with Meraki at one org that I worked for, the stackable switches, the wireless. We did the SD-WAN functionality, but that company didn't need a lot of complicated traffic like their topology, everything they were doing is very simple. Meraki's a slam dunk for that, and their environment didn't change very much. So it just made a lot of sense. Meraki was simple. It was operational, like operationalized, like very easily. You know, the NOC team, like we had a run, like it was just perfect. But there are companies that have complicated use cases that require a full-fledged SD-WAN solution that can do all the complicated things. Okay, so imagine, okay, I went with one of these single vendor SASEs and I realized we started off using firewall as a service in one of the others, but then we're getting to the SD-WAN part and we realize the SD-WAN solution that maybe they acquired is one of the SD-WAN lights, kind of, and doesn't meet our requirement. Okay, now we got to go hunt for an SD-WAN solution. It's tough. So to kind of back up, you know, the Gartner hype cycle or for zero trust networking in 2023, deep in the trough. Secure access services edge is in the trough of disillusionment due to exaggerated marketing from security vendors. Is that even a thing, really? By many technology vendors. There is plenty of noise about zero trust, which makes it difficult to distinguish solid practices from marketing hype. This is a big one, and this is one it's just hard if you're in that position to where you're trying to build these technologies out and you have the thumb on you to make it happen as quick as possible. You have a lot of pressure from leadership, and you're also getting a lot of pressure from your existing security vendors. It's just a tough landscape. And then the last one is vendors commonly generalize specific enterprise use cases and lead with their solution first. So what tends to happen, and I'm not going to name anybody, but I'm sure everybody can throw someone in this bucket, but they come, their product can do everything. Every question that you ask, they're going straight back to their product. The product. You know, in fact, they are learning nothing about you. They're learning nothing about your environment, and it's just a fire hose of how their product can solve your issues. And that there's no common sense there. It doesn't make any sense. So I can totally, like, all these things, dovetails exactly with what I've seen, the conversations I've had, and just my experiences deploying this stuff. So pragmatic way forward. This is where it's going to get into some of my own opinions about things, but there's also a lot of vendors that are coming to market that are like taking this approach today. I don't know if Gartner probably doesn't have a name for it, but I digress. So one thing that's interesting, the more, I talk to a lot of folks, a lot of leaders, and what makes cloud different? And you get, of course, if you ask anybody that, they're going to give you a different answer. But one of the things that fundamentally makes it different is the cloud providers, take AWS, for example, all of their backend stuff, they have a robust suite of APIs under the hood, which drive everything that they do. It drives the ClickOps, it drives the abstractions for the automations, it does all of these things. It's a completely API-based under the hood. It's an API-based ecosystem. And so this is what makes things, I would say that it allows you to speak the same language. So you get a response. It doesn't matter what vendor, like if you're using like a REST API, you get a response, and it's not going to be perfect from vendor to vendor. There's going to be some issues there every once in a while, but for the most part, you're speaking the exact same language. I'm not with the old, more legacy tech. You may have one interaction surface to this set of routers, and then another one for this set of routers, and everybody's speaking a different language, which means you can't integrate. And then you have all these CLI screen scraping tools that come in and try to generalize that for you, but that is to me, like I was talking about earlier, that's a short-term win to do something like that. Do you want to get at the root of the problem and tackle it that way? So for an example, say I'm a customer or a consumer, I'm going into cloud, I've got AWS cloud platform to worry about, but I've also got Cisco stuff. Or, insert whatever vendor that you want to insert, Infoblocks, all these things. Maybe some have REST API, maybe some don't. A lot of times the big box vendors are really trying to roll these out because they know they're popular and they're not consistent across their whole product portfolio. So maybe it's just for like the new platforms. But instead of, the vision that I see in the future, which is actually why I work where I work today, because I think it's a good vision, is instead of me as a consumer having to build custom tailored things for all of our pieces of technology infrastructure, what about having an integration layer? So it's almost, if you think about it, like instead of the SASE vendor is owning the development, the progression, the life cycle of those 5 things that roll under SASE, instead of doing that, why not let the vendors keep innovating where they're at? If it's a firewall vendor, a security vendor, whatever vendor it is, they keep innovating, and you have an infrastructure domain for like network or an infrastructure domain for security. And you take an integration play where you're talking at the API level for the integration, and then you can publish those in a sort of infrastructure platform. So that way, like me as a consumer, I have one interaction surface for like the whole domain of networking. So I can, if I want to do ClickOps, I can do ClickOps. If I want to hit an API, if I want to do Terraform, whatever type of infrastructure I want to do, that is my in there. And then once you build an integration at the API level, you begin to realize that it's not like building integrations in the 90s with the Ciscos of the world, at that time. It's much more streamlined. So integrating, I mean, for an example, like we've integrated with several vendors, like in under like 2 months, like very quickly. It's very fast. It's not a terrible heavy lift. So I mean, really, it's how do we maximize value? And we want to simplify operations. We want to simplify operational friction, and we want to deploy something that we can operate, first of all, and then for the life cycle of that thing, we want the support from our vendor. And that's one thing too that vendors need more pressure, because vendors are coming to the table and just throwing down what they think you should do and trying to force it down in the enterprise. And enterprises, have to come back and say no, putting pressure on the vendors for some of these outcomes, I think. And that's it. If you want to check out my podcast and give it 5 stars, I won't, that's great. Or if you want to connect or have any side conversations, I'd be happy to talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike.